information with you about the secrets to writing successful grant applications. Now, this is usually a 6-hour presentation with exercises, so we're going to dive into it in 20 minutes. First of all, my name is, as I said, Kerry Grace. I'm the founder and CEO of Evolve Group Network and the Community Practitioner Academy, and I'm also the Director of Regional Development for Regional Development Australia in the mid-north coast of New South Wales in Australia. Now, in order to be able to write funding applications, the first thing that you really need to do is pull together a funding toolkit. Now, on our website, we have a full list of what that funding toolkit would look like. But basically, it's things like photographs of your project. You'll need to have some background information about your project. You'll also need to have any quotes that you're requiring in order to get your project happening. And all of this information is really important because when funding applications are announced, they generally have about a 6-week time frame to be able to get in and apply. So quite often people will complain to me that they don't have enough time to complete their application. And what I say to them is you really need to get your funding toolkit ready so that you have it. Also included in that funding toolkit will be evidence. So you make sure that you've got the evidence that you require. If you jump over to communitypractitioneracademy.com.au, you can get this free list, which is your funding toolkit. And that's a really important thing to do. It does take a little while to pull together, but it's much better that you do that now rather than scrambling for the information at the last minute. Now, finding the funding source. So people always ask, where can I actually find funding? So if you're located in Australia, you can go to sites like business.gov.au and you'll find quite a comprehensive funding source within there. You could just use a simple Google. So let's say you're looking for funding to build some infrastructure in your community, or maybe you're looking for some funding to do some research. So just literally Google that and see what comes up, and you might be surprised. There's lots of different funding sources that you can get hold of. Certainly in the Australian context, you might be able to look at Commonwealth funding or federal funding. You might be able to look at funding that's relevant to your own state. So wherever you're located, it pays to get really across the different government departments of the day and follow them and follow the minister as well as closely as you can to work out what are their priorities at the moment, what is it that they're talking about, what is it that they're likely to fund, what are their program objectives, what are they trying to achieve. And this will give you some clues about what is current in funding. So funding follows political trends, essentially. If you think about government funding in the context of government being essentially your client, they're providing you with a contract, which the contract is in the form of funding, and they are requiring you to achieve a certain set of things for them that are in line with their policies of the day. They could change, and it's really good for you if you're looking for funding for something to have several different ways to articulate it. Now, I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that you work, this is a completely different example. Let's say you work with young people and families and your service is needing funding so that you can provide services to keep them fit and healthy and engaged in the community. So what you might do, if this is the type of funding you're looking for, you might be able to apply for funding through something like a Department of Education, so you can engage them in school or learning programs. Or you might be able to apply for funding through something like sport and recreation to help them to develop different activities. Or maybe you could use a creative industries type of funding source to be able to engage them through arts projects. So the more broadly you can actually describe what it is that you're looking for funding for, the more funding sources you'll have at your fingertips. Government funding isn't the only type of funding. You may also be able to apply for philanthropic funding. Now, this is basically funding that is coming from companies. It does usually get donated to an entity that has what is called in Australia deductible gift recipient status, or DGR status. And in order to have that, you require the tax status of a public benevolent institution, or PBI status. Now, to be able to get that funding, you don't have to run out and get that status. I meet far too many entities that decide to set up a not-for-profit so that they can get funding. in Australia, there's over 600,000 not-for-profits, and what I suggest is that you create a partnership with one that already exists. So let's say you want to build a new park and make a city a little bit more green and give families a place to go and for their kids to play. Rather than going out and becoming a not-for-profit to be able to apply for philanthropic funding based around that, what I suggest you do is you find maybe your local neighbourhood centre, maybe a child and family service, and you approach them and create a really robust partnership. Now, what that is called is an auspicing arrangement, and it means that they will look after your funding for you. They'll manage it, and in return, you'll pay them some kind of service fee. Usually it's between 10 and 20% of the funding. Now, this can be a really great partnership, provided that all of the expectations are clear up front for every party. Impact investment is something else that you may want to look at. I'm not going into that in this presentation, but it is also a different way to be able to get funding. So once you've found your source, the first thing that you need to do is not grab the application and start filling it out. I've made that mistake before, and I'll tell you right now, it can lead to tears because you may not be eligible. So the first thing you need to do is check the documentation that goes along with the grant, and every grant will have some form of instructions or documentation or grant papers. Check your eligibility. Now, this eligibility is actually from an actual Commonwealth Government grant that was in the marketplace last year, and its criteria, as you're looking down, it must be an incorporated not-for-profit organisation, which is actually an interesting definition because there's not any such thing. It will be an incorporated association. So not-for-profit is something that comes into a constitution as opposed to being a legal entity, which it is not. Nevertheless, it would be that status. It would also be, or could be, an Australian local government agency or body, or it could be a non-distributing cooperative. So if you wanted to apply for the grant and you were, for example, a sole trader, you would instantly see, okay, we're not eligible for this, but maybe we can make a partnership with a relevant entity so that they can auspice an application for us. Now, this particular grant also had eligible location as well. So your eligibility is definitely the very first place that you should start. Now, if you get a green light on that, the next thing I suggest, and this is actually really important, writing grants can be a very stressful period of time for you. What I say in getting your game face on is you really need to block out some time in your diary. So don't kid yourself and think you can carry on with your normal workload and, you know, family life, etc., and write a grant. You can't. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, they can require a lot of input and a lot of work. But the other side of it is the difference between a good grant and a great grant is that a great grant, you can see that the person has focused solely on that particular thing, and the writing that goes into the grant is then, it's succinct, it's current, it's in line with the policies of the day, it's using any jargon or buzzwords that are currently in the media, and you can really see the difference because when somebody really focuses in on a grant application, ticks all of those boxes that the entities are looking for in order to fund something that is in line with what they're wanting to invest in. Now, I hope that's making sense. Quite often, as I've been teaching grant writing for about 10 years, and the funny thing is teaching grant writing has nothing to do with writing grants. And that always really, I guess, confuses people a little bit. Grant writing is so much more about that. Yeah, it's great if you can string some good sentences together, but it's about everything that lives underneath, around, and on top of the actual application. So you need to be current in your language. You need to have those political or politics of the day linkages. You need to make sure that people know about it and are engaged in it. And it needs to be something that you can actually evidence is required. So getting your game face on, it enables you to have the time to be able to just focus in on writing your grant, and it's very important. Now, you found something that is eligible. You might have a general idea of what it is that you're wanting to fund, but it's important that you know.
Just real quick, I think the slides aren't moving along.
Oh, they're not?
No, sorry. Sorry, everybody, for interrupting.
How's that?
Moved along. Yes, now they have.
Oh, good. Okay, that's all right. I'll just go into that view. Oh dear, there's always some kind of technology issue, isn't there? Here we go. Okay, so in terms of the grant concept, are you happy for me to just start again from there, Teresa?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much.
That's okay. So in terms of your grant concept, you may have a good idea of what it is that you're wanting funding for, but your actual concept is what you wrap around the grant that you're applying for. Now, just a little bit before I mentioned that there's different, if you can think about the thing that you're wanting funding for through different concepts, so you can look for different funding streams. This is now your opportunity to be able to articulate what you're wanting to fund in terms of the grant that you're applying for. So let's say you found a funding opportunity that's for community grants, and your goal is to do up or modernise a community hall, just a typical community hall. So you've come across some Commonwealth funding. In fact, the Building Better Regions Fund would be something that's completely appropriate for this type of grant. And now what you're needing to do is build a concept around it. So what you would do is go and look through the criteria of the grant and build the idea out so it matches. Now that particular grant has to the best of my ability to remember exactly what it was. There may be a bit of creative license here. Community connectedness, you need to prove that the community is wanting this particular thing. You need to prove that it has a contribution to the community in which you're living in or wanting to apply for funding for as well. So your grant concept may have something along the lines of, now this is a New South Wales specific example that would be relevant to a community like mine. There were bushfires here, so you might say that you're wanting to modernise this community hall for the specific purpose of enabling it to support the community during bushfires and to give it more resilience. So that would be a buzzword that you could use, and to help in any recovery efforts so that you can essentially future-proof this community. Now that would be quite different to if you were wanting to use this grant for a community hall to put in new technology so that you could have great dance parties so that you could engage the community. So you can see that too. So maybe if you're applying for an arts grant, you might want to do something like that. Whereas if you're applying for a technology or an infrastructure grant, you might be wanting to pull out a whole different suite of benefits. So basically, when you're forming up a funding concept, what you're going to do is you're going to state your organisation's name, will deliver whatever project it's called in partnership with whatever the funding body is under the grant name. The next thing you need to be able to do is say exactly what you'll deliver or do. So get really specific about it. So we will modernise the hall to include 5G telecommunications access, or maybe we will install digital projectors or something like that. This will enable us to be more resilient during times of bushfires or engage our community in a more effective way. And then what is your expected impact? Now, once you've developed this funding concept, what I want you to be able to do is to say this to people again and again and again. And there is a reason for this. When people come to me to ask for letters of support for their projects, they'll quite often have or be wanting to have 20-minute, 1 hour, 2 hour long conversations about how great their project is. And by the time of, well, I actually, to be frank, wouldn't sit through that. People just don't have time to sit through that. They do have time to sit through a 90-second spiel, which is what this should be. One of the grant writing workshops I was delivering, I actually mentioned this to a lady, and she had already her elevator pitch or funding concept together, and she'd managed to stand next to a high net worth individual at an event, and she was able to say a spiel just like this. And he said, "How much money do you need?" And she said, "I need 100,000. And he said, "Okay." Now that stuff really does happen, but it only happens to people who have a very, very polished spiel, and they can instantly articulate what it is that they need and why it's a good thing as well. with 600,000 not-for-profits in Australia alone, there's a lot of people out there doing great things. And don't get me wrong, if I had enough money, I'd fund all of them, but nobody has enough money to fund all of those things. So the projects that get funded are the ones that can not only articulate what it is that they're wanting to do, they can also tell a story about why it's important, but they have the evidence to back it up as well, and that is really important. Writing really good grant applications is about building trust with the community or the people or the entities that you're asking for funding from. Okay, now finding supporting data is important. So you're going to need to find ways to be able to find some supporting data. Now there's lots of different ways you can go around that. The Australian Bureau of Statistics obviously has quite a lot of data that you can use. You might also connect with your Regional Development Australia entity, and if you are in Australia, and I do apologise if you're not located in Australia, I've obviously been pretty heavy on supporting that. If you're not actually located in Australia, I'm sure that there are many entities that can support you, but in the Australian context, there is a Regional Development Australia body that covers the entire country, so you can get statistics via them as well to assist. Your supporting data is very important though, and of course making sure it comes from a credible source is very important. Now writing the actual grant, and this is where we'll leave the presentation, hopefully with you wanting more information about it. Just a couple of tips. So avoid fluff and vague claims. There is nothing more annoying to somebody assessing grant applications than to hear things like young people deserve opportunities. Duh, we all know that. All of the young people we spoke to are interested in this. Well, that's either not true or you didn't speak to more than 3 young people. Now that grant is going to instantly, that application will instantly go in the bin because there is just nothing in it to substantiate the need for somebody to fund it. Whereas if you look at the bottom example, there's some data there. It's also providing credibility through this granted fictitious report. Make sure that you're aiming in that direction. You also want to highlight key points, but you've got to align it back to the grant and the funding criteria. So in this particular instance, this is what has happened. The other thing is you want to stick to the word count, and word counts are critical. So you can see in this example the difference just 4 words can make in the 2 different paragraphs, which really have the same intent. Sticking to the word count is important, but sometimes, and you must be aware of this, the application will actually ask you to stick to a character count. Now that will be in your funding criteria or your funding papers, and you need to check that. More often these days, grant applications are actually online, and the online system should cut you off, but you do still need to be aware of it. I always suggest if you're going to use one of the online portals to apply for a grant, that you do keep a Word document running, and there's 2 reasons for that. The first is you can play with the words a little bit, check your word count, make sure the spelling's okay, and also the grammar as well if you have Grammarly or something like that on your computer. But you can also save it, and when you apply for another grant in the future, then you're able to copy and paste, and never be afraid to do that. You don't need to find the same data every single time. It's very tedious to do that. Sticking to the word count's important though. When you're creating your application, you'll probably need a statement of around about 250 words to describe exactly what it is, and that's what the minister or your local member of parliament or the funding body will use in order to describe it, or it'll be a media grab. You'll then need a little bit longer statement, so that next one will be, I apologise, the first one's about 120 words, the second one's about 250, and that's where a little bit more detail goes. And then when you're looking at addressing your funding criteria, it's usually between 250 to 500 words, of course, depending on what is actually going into the application. It can be longer sometimes. I'm finding that funding applications and the required word counts are becoming more and more succinct, which is really great. So you must demonstrate value for money is a question that quite often comes up in funding applications, and these are some different ways to answer it. So you might partner with existing services, you might be avoiding duplication, skilled team staff, etc. So there's some different ways. Now I'm actually going to leave the presentation at this point. That's exactly 20 minutes. I'll leave you on this slide and you can have a look at that one if you like. I do see people make a lot of mistakes in grant writing, and often those mistakes can be really stressful, really tiring, and it can mean that a really great project doesn't get to market. So try not to make any of these mistakes. So I'll look forward to seeing you in the live session. And as I said before, if you wanted to visit Community Practitioner Academy, there's a lot more grant writing resources for you over there. Thank you so much for listening.